A warm welcome to all our viewers. Of course, the Minister of Finance has just delivered his Budget 2021 speech, and this evening will be the only feedback session on the budget and the detail in the budget that you need to attend. Again, sponsored by Business Day and Efficient Group, and I will elaborate a bit more on these two businesses and the panel. Presented by the Efficient Group, Dawie Roodt and Lukanyo Mnyanda from Business Day, and their titles. Hovering on the edge, what did Tito actually say? But before we kick off with the specialists, let's just reflect back into history. Let's have a look what happened over time. I think I'm just on the wrong slide, but that we will rectify quickly. Let's just go back. One, two, another one, and another one. That will be a brief glimpse on what I'm actually going to tell you about, but let's start there. Let's have a look at some of the fiscal accounts. Relative to GDP, something that we need to take into account. Starting way back in 1964. Of course, a very good year because that was the year I was born in. 1964. The red line is government expenditure. The way that government is actually spending money. The blue line is the revenue line, or all the taxes that's being collected and what's being paid by myself and you. We will always see that the red line is much higher than the blue line. And what we will see is that if we look back in 1964, expenditure relative to GDP was roughly about 15%, and this grew to more than 30%, so more than doubled. Please take in consideration that the numbers after 2001 is actually the projections going forward. It was only in the period 2008, 2009 and 2010 where we saw the Minister of Finance at that stage, Trevor Manuel, managing debt right down. For the first time ever in history, we saw a deficit surplus. And this is not happening currently. This actually graphs are growing away from each other. And one of the details that our experts, panelists, are going to discuss later. Relative to GDP, what's happening on the expense side, and relative to GDP, what is happening on the revenue side. I think what we also need to have a look at is actually the third account on the fiscal side, and that is debt relative to GDP. Going back to 2003, what we've seen is that actually in the new government era that we are right now, they inherited quite high debt levels. But the Minister of Finances during that period got it managed effectively down. And if we look again right at the period 2008, 2009 and 2010, what happened to the debt levels at that stage? Under the leadership of the different faces that you will see on the screen. But since 2012, 2013, especially under the leadership on the finance side of Pravin Gordhan, we've seen a dramatic increase in debt. And this is where we get to the name hovering on the edge. Looking at debt levels currently and looking at the forecast of debt levels, where that is going, that is a concerning factor. Hovering on the edge, meaning that we're right there where we could step into a debt trap or even fall over the debt cliff. Much more detail will be discussed in these scenarios by our specialist. All right, Lukanyo, I don't think that you need much introduction. Doing a great job with Business Day, and thank you for being part of our panel this evening and being one of the specialists. Where we will elaborate on the local, the international, also a bit on the political side, giving the feedback that we had. Dawie Roodt, Chief Economist of the Efficient Group, maybe the financial services business in South Africa. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us and being part of the panel, and we'll take some detail. I know that you gave me a brief introduction, hovering on the edge. We are going to look on the international side, as I mentioned, the local side, the revenue and the expenses, what's happening there. Quite interesting that Tito didn't mention anything or a special budget for SIA or Eskom, but is that really the truth? What is happening with the wage bill? And then, of course, deficit and debt. I just mentioned it, hovering on the edge, going into this debt trap. Where are we standing actually? And then, of course, the detail is in the devil and the sting is in the tail. And just from my side, Lukanyo and Dawie, and I would like you to take it away. What was your first impressions on the budget speech from Tito in 2021?
I think what got me started, like as I was sitting there reading the documents, the statement of intent, I mean, from the word go, I mean, it's almost like the numbers were an afterthought, not an afterthought, but the point he starts with is about getting, he used to speak about the mouth of the hippo, closing the mouth of the hippo. And I think the intent was very clear from the word go, and that was really my first impression that I think I took from there, even reading from the front page onwards. And it sort of really kept that theme, Dawie. Like, obviously, we'll discuss the actual numbers, whether he achieved it.
Yeah.
But I think the intention, it goes a long way. I don't know what.
Yes. Thank you, Lukanyo. I must just tell you, thank you very much for being here tonight and being here, sharing this platform with me. It's really an honor to have you here. We've known each other for, let's rather not say. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, Willem, for that introduction. And I must just say to the team, especially Francois, for helping me preparing this specific budget. Thank you very much, Francois. It's really nice of you. My first impressions on the budget, well, we have to remember that the Minister of Finance is moving within certain constraints. And these constraints are financial constraints, but they are also political constraints. And he needs to do certain things, but has he got the political capital to do that? And quite often it's very difficult to, it's easy to say this and that needs to happen, but it's much more difficult to actually do that because of the political constraints. My first impressions certainly was that Tito Mboweni did what he could do under very difficult circumstances, and he actually painted not a very pretty picture, to be honest, but that's the way it is. That's the way it is indeed. And I think it's important for all of us to understand what is going on. So my first impressions for Tito Mboweni is certainly positive. The picture is not a pretty picture. And I think that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lukanyo. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the presentation and stop here and there, and we can discuss it a little bit from there. You agree with me now?
Thank you, Dawie, and thanks for having me here again.
Okay, let's get going. And let's have a look at the budget of the Minister of Finance, and let's start off, and we call it hovering on the edge, and indeed I believe it is hovering on the edge. Maybe just a major trend that's happening internationally. I just give this for a bit of a background so that they understand the world out there a little bit. Things like, for example, artificial intelligence. We call it sometimes the gig economy. People are working from home all of a sudden. Bitcoin and other private currencies are all the rage all of a sudden. Bitcoin is over $1 trillion, by the way. Genetic engineering, all that. So the world out there is changing. And the world out there is changing very, very fast. And for South Africa to be part of this changing environment, this changing world, we really must be sure that we can adapt and that we have the necessary people to participate in this new world in which we find ourselves. Internationally, I think a couple of things are very, very clear. One is that there's amazing, incredible, huge, I don't know what words I can use, fiscal stimulus coming from countries like, for example, the United States and even the Europeans, the Chinese, all of them, they're spending money like there is no tomorrow. That's a good thing in the short term, of course. Also, if you look internationally, monetary policy is exceptionally accommodative, meaning interest rates are exceptionally low. And the central banks in the world promised to us, they promised that they will keep interest rates very accommodative for a long time. We see the financial markets are just roaring ahead. And obviously because of all the stimulus, but also because the financial markets believe that the world economy will be doing quite well. Here and there, I'm picking up some inflation fears. People are getting a little bit worried about future inflation. And I also must say, after Trump at least, I would say that the political environment internationally is certainly, well, much more, let's call it accommodative. Much easier accommodative. So I guess that's more or less the international environment. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Willem and Lukanyo?
Actually, that's a very interesting point as well, Dawie. Like, I think a lot of people will ask you about, you mentioned the stimulus you're seeing in the West, you're seeing in China. Then they will ask you, why can't we do the same? It does seem a bit unfair, doesn't it?
Exactly.
When we sit here and we watch the UK deficit go to 100% or whatever it is and going higher, and now they keep extending their stimulus. Of course, I mean, the answer is quite simple. We are not in a similar situation.
Exactly.
We don't print pounds here. We don't print dollars. And it does seem unfair, but as you say, it's a constraint we have to live with.
Yeah.
And
that's what we're going to unpack tonight and see if we can understand it a little bit better. Maybe I'm going to walk and go into some dangerous territory here and just talk a little bit politics. And obviously, and as we all know, there's this clash within the ANC. There are various factions within the ANC. I think you get the good guys and you get the bad guys. We all know who that is. And then we get some of the other guys. And I would argue that Tito Mboweni is one of the other guys because he's not typically one of the either left or right guys. He's sort of a lone voice in the wilderness. What I did like about Tito Mbowene's comment about the Constitution, saying that we're a constitutional democracy, the Constitutional is supreme, and the Constitution is supreme, and we all have to stick within the rules of a Constitution. I think that was a sort of a pinch in the direction of the Secretary General of the ANC. And then the reality also is, whether we like it or not, we've got a government that is very inefficient. We've had massive mismanagement, corruption the last couple of years, decades perhaps even, and today we're paying the price for that, and we're paying a very dear price. And maybe a last comment, I will not be surprised if Tito Mboweni is on his way out.
Yes, I think that was one of the questions that I also had for Lukanyo. You know, maybe at a political view. What do you think is going to happen with him?
I suppose I should start by saying, me as a financial journalist, I don't have good guys, bad guys. I just got guys, and sometimes one of the guy is good today, the next day is not so good. But I mean, it's interesting. Like, as you mentioned the constitutional issue, and whether it's a direct message aimed at anybody else. I mean, I actually thought it was a message aimed, but I wasn't actually thinking as explicitly political as that. I was thinking more in terms of the debates that we're going to be having around the wage deal.
Good point.
Because remember, the government did go into court against the unions and actually won that case. And obviously, the last year of that wage agreement wasn't implemented, of the 3-year agreement, which ends this year, and so the new one is starting to be negotiated for this year. And I think that's what the message he was saying. I won this in court, so next time you're not going to do what you did in 2018 and concede to a deal that the Treasury doesn't agree with. But of course, if it turns out he is overruled over that, then I think his position would be untenable. So I don't know whether, and also whether he goes or not. I mean, from the day one when he first arrived, he said, I didn't want the job. He said, the president begged me. So he's always giving that impression that he could go any day. So no, I don't know if I take that all seriously. But I think if he was overruled on the wage issue, and I think that would have to be a resigning issue for him, I would think.
Yeah, I hope Kusal heard that specific one. Yeah. Not too much about politics. Willem, can I go on the economy?
Yes, just before we run on to that. The whole wage bill sort of message was a very silent message today. Or was it not?
No, I don't think it was silent. I think it was quite a clear message. Yeah. We're not going to give you any increases. I think that's
we're not going to negotiate. Thank you. Dawie, please run into the next the economy side.
Okay, before we get to the actual budget, let me just go through the South African economy. Let's just have a look at a couple of graphs, a couple of numbers on the South African economy. I've got a few here, so I'm going to touch on some of those. Let me show you the pictures, rather. And I think the pictures, as they say, speak 1,000 words. Now, here's one picture. This is just inflation and interest rates in South Africa. The dotted red line, by the way, is from there on forward. Those are our estimates, or the estimates of the Minister of Finance. The point I want to make is that inflation is likely to gradually creep up over the next couple of months, perhaps the next year or two. There is a possibility of inflation becoming a problem, but for now it's not a major issue, and I think interest rates are going to remain fairly flat. There could be a bit of an increase in interest rates later this year or early next year or so, but for now interest rates low and likely to remain low for a long time. This is a new graph that we prepared this afternoon. And what I want to point out here is, are we going to see inflation or not? And one of the drivers of inflation, obviously, is money. So we've played around with the numbers a little bit, and this is just the red line is just money supply increase, M3 increase, and we plot it against inflation. And clearly money supply is not increasing by that much, and that's usually a sign of inflation also that's likely to remain fairly low. This is our calculation on the under or overvaluation of the currency, the rand. The blue line is the average undervaluation. The rand's always undervalued, and at the moment the rand is pretty much on its historic undervaluation average, so to speak. So what's going to happen now? Well, if I have to choose between dollar of rands at the moment, it really doesn't matter. The rand is pretty much valued at the moment where it historically is, and that is the historic undervaluation. Having said that, my suspicion is over time the rand will continue to depreciate. One of the reasons why the rand recently appreciated quite nicely is this one, and this is the balance of payments, specifically the current account. The current account doing very, very well, especially for two reasons. We've stopped importing because people are just not demanding stuff anymore. And secondly, we are exporting very, very nicely, especially commodities. The commodity guys doing very well. And of course, they're paying taxes as well. That's the commodity exporters. But bottom line is capital flowing into South Africa because of the surplus of current account supporting the South African currency as well. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. I just want to show South Africa's gross savings in South Africa currently between 15 and 18% or 15 and 20% over time. Currently, it's under tremendous pressure because people are dissaving because of the lockdown. It's bounced back a little bit, but this is important a little bit later because when I talk about the state's borrowing, and this is the state itself, the dissaving of the state. Essentially what happens, the state borrows a lot of money, and this year they will probably borrow about 700 billion rand. And of that 700 billion rand, 300 billion will be spent on capital investments, and the rest will be spent on current investment or current expenditure, simply meaning that the state is a massive destroyer of capital to the tune of a couple of 100 billions of rands. Unemployment in South Africa, as we all know, this is heartbreaking to see a third of the workforce out of jobs in South Africa, a horrible number. Local economic growth, we expect about 8% contraction. The minister is slightly more bullish, 7.2%. And for next year and the year thereafter, we expect further weak economic numbers as well. Lukanyo.
No, like looking at those numbers, I mean, we discussed whether or not the minister is being realistic or not. I mean, we know he's looking for minus 7.2. I think the last MPC is looking around 8. And then you think, okay, like, and then what, 3.3% next this coming year, 1.9 the next 3 years. I mean, no, like for example, I know you would argue like he's being over optimistic on GDP, and I mean, I just worry like even if he isn't. I mean, because when you look at that graph you gave, 32%, 32.5% unemployment. Yeah. I mean, we went through a decade during the Zuma era where we were barely hitting 1% as a positive, like, and that was a crisis then. So how much more of a crisis now when we've had exactly. Such a big 8-9% or whatever it is, the contraction in the end, and then if we like do 1.9 for the next 2 or 3 years, surely that's not good enough for us to deal with the kind of crisis we're dealing with. Yeah. And I suppose I would ask you a question: what needs to be done from here, other than just like cutting spending? Because only so much spending you can cut.
Just on this point, Lukanyo, I mean, you're talking about the unemployment numbers, and then also the announcement today about this number of 100 billion rand that's going to be set aside for employment. And we also use the words job creation, and that's not what we do. I mean, 100 billion rand set aside to create jobs, is that the right thing?
Yeah. Well, I would argue no, that's not the right thing to do. I don't like the word job creation. I like the word economic growth, and jobs will follow. But I'm afraid, Lukanyo, how are we going to get this economy to grow faster? Well, for one, we have to do something about electricity. We just don't have enough electricity. It's like governing a car. You know, the car can't grow faster than 2% because we just don't have electricity. But there are many, many other things. The fiscal account is only but one problem. There are many other issues that we need to address. For example, we've just seen a significant increase in the minimum wage in an environment where we have unemployment levels in excess of 30%. Now that is, I mean, how can you do that? I'm not even talking about other labor legislations. I'm not even talking about labor relations and the like. Those are some of the issues that we need to address.
Just Dawie, just before we run into your next session, just to the viewers, if you actually look at your link, there's a chat box. So if there's any burning issues or questions that you would like us to ask to the panelists, please drop your questions in the chat box. That will come through to me, and I will be asking you the questions from the audience. To the viewers that actually logged in and actually watching the show tonight, please make use of the chat box. If we can't answer them there, they will be answered within the next 24 hours.
Thanks, Willem. Anything else? Can I go on with the revenue figures?
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Now let's have a look at the revenue figures. Now the revenue figures, that typically are the various taxes of the Minister of Finance, and I'm just going to touch on some of these. And as always, I start off with the graph that Willem started off with. Remember, the red line is state spending as a percentage of GDP, and Willem made the comment that state spending since 1964 until today basically more than doubled. So we've got the state that's been getting bigger and bigger, and they've been spending like crazy, and the state is by far the biggest single player in the South African economy. The blue line is how we fund this thing. And as you can see, inevitably, if state spending goes up, the tax burden will go up as well. But what we've seen in recent years, despite certain tax increases, the actual tax take relative to GDP has been going relatively flat. And maybe I can just make that comment, look at that red line. From now on onwards, despite a number of cutback on state spending, it will keep on going up, at least in the short term, in the next year or two. But what we're going to talk about now is state revenue, the various taxes. It has been going up quite a lot, and let's see what some of the announcements of the Minister of Finance. Before I get to that, let's just see where the Minister of Finance gets the bulk of his money. 38%, that's more than 500 billion rand, comes from personal income taxes. I'm going to give you a bit of a breakdown of that just now. The second most important tax for the Minister of Finance is value-added tax. That's about 27%. Value-added tax is a so-called indirect tax. And the third most important tax to the Minister of Finance is corporate taxes, company taxes, and that's just over 200 billion rand. And then a couple of various other kinds of taxes. An important one, the fourth most important tax out there, is the fuel levy, and that's that 6% over there. And then a number of other taxes as well. Those are the three major ones. And let's just have a look at some of the announcements by the Minister of Finance. He did announce a 2 billion rand cut in personal income taxes, which basically is more or less in line to address the effect of fiscal drag. Fiscal drag simply means that you move into a higher income tax bracket, although you're only getting compensated for inflation, and then you pay more tax. It's simply adjusted for that. So hardly an adjustment on that. Sin taxes, significant increase in sin taxes, which can be a bit of a danger. Fuel tax increase 26 cents a litre. Corporate income taxes, the Minister of Finance mentioned that he's planning to reduce that from currently 28% to later 27%, but only later in 2 years' time. He killed this initial idea of a 40 billion rand increase in various taxes, so we're not going to see significant tax increases anymore as they suggested at the medium-term budget. And then the Minister of Finance mentioned that total tax revenue in the current financial year is likely to be about 200 billion or so below the original budgeted estimates. I think it's far too optimistic. My estimates suggest that the tax revenue is going to be even worse than that. Remember, usually the financial year ends the end of March. We've got 2 months still, and that is, 3 months perhaps, January, February and March. We need that data before we can see really what the revenue for the year is, and I'm afraid it's going to be probably less than what the Minister of Finance is predicting, which is going to put him on a back foot when it comes to the next financial year. A huge increase in the sin taxes. I'm afraid this is probably going to force the alcohol and tobacco industry underground even more. I think that was a huge mistake. Let me just go through this, and I think this is very important. On the left-hand side, I have the number of personal income tax payers. On top, there's a thin line on top. It says 113,000 individuals. 113,000 individuals in South Africa pays 27% of total personal income taxes. 27% of that. The first, and you can see that first bracket on the left-hand side, there are 2 million individuals there. 2 million individuals out of the whole population in South Africa pay 82% of total personal income taxes, the most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance. 51%, the bottom 51% personal income tax payers, they may be registered as personal income tax payers, but they pay zilch nothing because their income falls below the threshold. That's personal income taxes, exceptionally progressive in South Africa. This is company taxes. Look at the left-hand side again. Look at that number on top, 763 companies in South Africa. 763 companies, not thousands. 763 companies in South Africa pay 63% of total company taxes in South Africa. The top 5% companies in South Africa, the top 36,000 companies in South Africa pay 96% of total company taxes. We are exceptionally dependent on less than 1,000 companies in South Africa for just about all the company taxes in the country. A couple of other issues. No wealth tax was announced. I think it would have been a mistake. It's anyway too complicated and very difficult to administer. The minister did not talk about the loop structures again. I don't know, Lukanyo, if you want to comment on that. No. Export tax on scrap metal was introduced. I think Minister Patel can be thanked for that. And then, like I've mentioned earlier, I think the Minister of Finance needs to be extremely careful. His estimates on revenue is probably far too optimistic optimistic, and the actual tax collections in the current financial year, which only ends the end of March, is probably going to be less than what the Minister of Finance is currently penciling in.
I mean, that's interesting looking at those numbers. Again, I'm thinking if you were sitting here with somebody else, say somebody from Kosatu or Zolinzi Mavavi, you'd be having a big debate, for example, whether or not this is an austerity budget. I actually was listening on the radio as I was coming here. And then when you look at these numbers, and especially I was actually quite impressed on the tax front, the fact that they didn't increase personal taxes. Because I would have thought that would be seen as an easy way to raise a bit of money, even though it might not be a good thing in the long term, because just due to the narrow of the tax base. But then of course, I mean, there is a reason for that. South Africa's got this history that everybody knows, and it's not going to change anytime soon. So that I think we've got this dilemma, don't we? I mean, and on the one level, this is a country of rich and poor, but a country of much of inequality. So you have to have some kind of redress. But how do you do the redress while also then encouraging the wealth creation? Because I don't think either one of them is unnegotiable. They're both non-negotiable. So how do you do both?
Yeah, the answer to that is there's only one answer, and that is to put measures in place to make sure that the economy grow. But you're right, I must tell you, I'm also pleasantly surprised to hear that Minister of Finance did not increase. I was worried about the possible increase in personal income taxes. It is very high already, he did not do that. But I'm pretty sure that he was tempted to do that. And the same, the announcements on corporate taxes, that he's planning to reduce corporate taxes in future.
But taking that into account, sorry Lukanyo, taking that into account, are we moving in the right direction of making it easier for companies to grow in South Africa? We just heard a week ago, Sabanya, their CEO, their announcement that they made 20 billion available. They're only going to put in about 7 or 8 billion. I mean, growing, they're taking certain steps towards COVID in their own hands, the big companies. Are we making it easier for these guys on a tax base or even business-wise to open up business and grow business in South Africa, getting foreign investment back into South Africa?
I mean, I think that is a structural issue we've been talking about, right? It's like, are they moving fast enough? Actually, I mean, one of the things about the budget, in fairness to the minister, for me, it's almost to me like a rallying call, calling for reform. It's almost like, we talked about politics, but for me, it seems like, a lot of it is actually a lecture to his own colleagues, saying, we've some of the things we've left for too long. We need to get moving on these things. I mean, if you read that, the section on Operation Vulindlela, for example, there's a lot of talk about Vulindlela, what we need to do. But a lot of those actually are policies that are already been adopted, or at least they've been accepted. But for me, it seems like he was crying out for implementation. So I think, to his credit, he recognizes that. But then, as we keep saying, there's politics. We've known what to do about ESCOM, but we just haven't done it because there's always the vested interest. Yeah. And they're not always also let's not be too pessimistic and be too cynical. It's not always about corruption. It can also be about people just having ideological resistance to certain things, just because they actually don't like them or they disagree with them.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this, and that is that I've got a suspicion. That's my view. I want to see if you share that, and that is that I get the idea that Tito Mboweni is being isolated in a way, sidelined in a way. Do you share that sentiment?
It is a perception out there, and it's a perception that's widespread. That's definitely. But I think, in terms of public utterances, that the president has always said he supports him. So I think the question then becomes, can he do these things? Can he implement these policies? I was actually asking a colleague today, was it 2 years or 3 years ago that the Treasury had that policy document reform?
Yes.
But we couldn't even remember whether it was 2 or 3 years ago. That's how long it's been sitting on the shelf.
Exactly.
And most of the things there are sensible things, and it's hard to find anybody in government who will openly say, I disagree, we shouldn't have more spectrum, or I disagree that we shouldn't reform our energy policy, or I disagree we shouldn't do. most of these things are actually quite obvious things that you won't find anybody in government who disagrees with them. It's just to get this machinery to work and actually do what it says it's supposed to do. And I think that was like the minister's main theme today. Like that's what I got the impression here. Like his speech was not really meant at us; it was actually meant at his colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's his biggest challenge at the moment.
And yes, Dawie, before you jump into the next section, I think your comment is true. That was the first year that we haven't seen the little Aloe with Tito in Parliament. And I think the reason is because he couldn't get hold of a cactus. And that's maybe true. So at least we've got a little cactus here with a couple of, but I mean, at least COVID protected. I thought I just had to bring my little friend along and just to tell Tito, sorry, if he was not allowed his aloe in Parliament, at least on stage we were allowed a little COVID cactus.
Thank you, Willem. Let me get to the expenditure. That's the next item. And as always, we started with the same graph. Now, again, let me just highlight the red line, which is the state spending as a percentage of GDP. And we've seen a huge increase in state spending as a percentage of GDP. Now, the Minister of Finance, and we've mentioned that, he's trying to cut back on state spending, and we'll touch on one or two of those items. But the reality is that this is a massive big ship. You cannot turn the fiscal accounts around in 1 or 2 years' time. It takes some time. And unfortunately and inevitably, what we're going to see over the next year or 2, 3, a further increase in state spending. Maybe the comment that you make, Lukanyo, about whether this is an austerity budget, that certainly is not the case. With a huge fiscal deficit like what we're seeing there, for instance, a huge increase in the debt levels, this is nothing but a highly expansionary fiscal stance of the Minister of Finance, and I did mention some numbers earlier. But let's break down the expenditure numbers a little bit. Some of the most important expenditure numbers, the most important one, that 23%, that is education. South Africa spends more on education than most countries in the world. Unfortunately, the quality of our education is not only bad, it is of the worst in the world. Number 2 is certain public services. Social protection is that 20% over there. That's primarily the various grants and so on, and a couple of other ones there as well. This is excluding interest. Interest of the big expense items. Interest is the fastest growing big expense item, and at the current rate, interest as a percentage of total percentage will probably be bigger than education within, say, 2 or 3 years at the current rate of increase. Talking about the grants increase were well below inflation. Now, that is politically extremely difficult to do. Grants increase, the highest was just over 3% for the child support grant. Most of the other grants were just over 1% or so, well below inflation. Keep in mind that the uninsured insurance fund spent more than 100 billion rand. Because of this support, this so-called TERS support package. And people spending that money, many of them pay VAT, and that's part of the reason why the VAT collections also did well. But the deficit now in the unemployment insurance fund is around about 20 billion. Municipality grants, that's a good thing. The Minister of Finance, he said, listen, you guys, if you don't spend money on capital, I'm going to cut that. He's doing that. Excellent idea. And then the Minister of Finance did say he's going to cut the wage bill over the next 3 years by 265 billion rand. We just have to make something very clear. There's no cuts. This is absolutely no cut. What they were planning to do is not to spend as much as they originally planned to spend. So this is no real cut. This is just spending less than what the plans originally was to actually spend. Now, this is the number of grants recipients in South Africa. The red line are the number of grants recipients, roughly about 18 million, and it's likely to keep on increasing. And the blue line is the number of people with actual jobs in South Africa. If you look, for example, at 20 years ago, we had 3 people working for 1 person receiving a grant, and today it's less than 1%. A very good social security system is one with fewer people, not with more people. But this is the point that you make earlier, Lukanyo, this actually shows the massive levels of unemployment and poverty in South Africa. There was 1 or 2 other announcements. The bank loan scheme, which I don't really understand what the minister what he means by that. Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit. It's going to move to the non-banking, so the non-bank institutions will be included in there. And nothing about the national health insurance. And then the wage increase, like I've said, over the next couple of years, just over 1% for the next 2 years that the Minister of Finance is penciling in. Lukanyo.
So many points you covered there. Like I know, like on the bank guarantee scheme. I mean, obviously that has been quite a failure, and also like it sort of discredits government in a way, because remember like with much fanfare last year the president unveiled 500 billion stimulus 500 billion, I say again. But of that, 200 billion is supposed to be this bank scheme. And as far and so far, only about 8% of that has actually gone. So the stimulus is nowhere near like 500 billion. So even if you take all the other stuff, like, like a lot of it was tax deferred and stuff. So like you can have debates whether it's new money or not. But the impression was created that this guarantee scheme was like 200 billion to the banks, and the banks have to lend it out. Obviously, that's not the case. Yeah. And so I think that is a problem. I actually thought he might steer away from that, because I don't see how they're going to fix it really. And not through the banks anyway. As we know now, the banking system is actually stabilized a bit, so the banking system can actually make its own decisions as far as not about funding people, Yeah. So, and I mean, it's all very vague. I mean, I can see a bit in the document where they talk about including other players, including the development finance institutions like the IDC, but that's all about what we're going to be discussing. So I don't think any of that is something that's going to happen today or tomorrow or even next week. I mean, probably even never. I think that there might be a lot of politics in there.
The obvious way to fix it is to simply say, listen, the state is going to take a bigger knock on the bad loans, so to lower the credit criteria. Obviously, that's the way to fix it.
I mean, that's the only way they work. I mean, if you go to the UK and everywhere else, because they work, at least they could be more take up because the government is willing to take a bigger hit if it has to. But then, as I said earlier, we're not the UK. We don't sit here and print pounds and not get punished by the market for it. I mean, it might seem unfair. It does seem unfair. The fact that when you watch those countries, like the debt levels go like this, and then yet the interest rates go like this.
Isn't it?
And then you're sitting here 9% or whatever it is, our 10-year bond yield, and then the UK government has doubled. It's got the biggest deficit in its history, and yet investors are paying it to keep their money for them.
It's an upside down world. But I guess the international monetary policy internationally is actually contributing to this weird world in which we are living in.
No, definitely. But then we kind of feel sorry for ourselves. And I mean, it might seem unfair, but we're not going to change it by complaining about it. So what we can do, we can try and control what we can. And then I think that number, that red and blue number, we definitely need to get that number the other way around. We need to get that blue number this, and then that red number down. And I mean, that's the only sustainable future this country will have.
Exactly. And that came through right after the budget speech, the questions and answer session with the minister. And he had a question coming from the audience, the public out there. And the question was asked, why didn't grants raise in line with inflation? And his answer was very simple. This is how big the budget is. I mean, this is all money we've got. So if you increase something with 10 Rand and that's not in line with inflation, this is the money that we have. And I think that is a very concerning factor looking at that red line going. Just a last comment on education. I know that a lot of the matrics got their results, their personal results today. Well done to all those teachers and to all those kids with 11 distinctions. I see 2. And then, what did they do? They just study. COVID did them well. Well done, all of your matrics and all of the teachers that did a hell of a job during COVID. And I hope that big budget, some of it comes to you.
The most important point is that the Minister of Finance is budgeting for a very, very small wage increase for civil servants. Politically, that's going to be a tough one to pull off. Let's hope he's going to be successful in that. Let's have a look at the next one, the deficit and the debt numbers. Obviously, let's have a look at our numbers again. The red line, state spending, the blue line, the revenue, and the gap between the two, the crocodile's mouth, as the Minister of Finance calls that, is how much they need to borrow. That is referred to as a so-called fiscal deficit. Now, this graph is exactly the same. It's a gap between how much they spent and how much they're getting in by way of various taxes. This is the consolidated one, by the way. It's a bit of a technical thing. Don't worry too much about that. The bottom line is that I believe the Minister of Finance is too optimistic in the current financial year. We're waiting for the final numbers for the current financial year. I think the deficit is going to be bigger. And I think also that the deficit in coming years is probably going to be larger than what the Minister of Finance is expecting now. And there are various reasons for that. The most important reason is to do with weaker economic growth. This is the same graph that Willem showed us earlier, but this time around I have the Ministers of Finance there. Now, we had a number of Ministers of Finance the last 20 years, but 2 of them, or maybe 3 of them, was there for quite a long period of time. Of course, Trevor Manuel was there for a long time. Trevor Manuel was the guy that was, there was some luck involved, don't be mistaken, but Trevor Manuel was the guy that oversees state debt levels going down to much lower levels. And then we had Pravin Gordhan most of the time, and I'm afraid Pravin Gordhan was there, and he was, I must say, if there's somebody that is responsible from a Minister of Finance point of view for the mess in which we are in today, I would like to point a finger to Pravin Gordhan. He certainly should take a lot of responsibility now. And now we have Tito Mboweni, and he has been passed this really hot potato by way of an increasing debt burden. One or two comments about the deficit and the debt. Moody's did indicate that they're probably going to downgrade us further. I'm afraid I have to agree with them. I think the debt levels will exceed the estimates of the Minister of Finance. Are we going to default? The short answer to that is no. South Africa is not going to default. We have enough foreign reserves to cover our foreign loans. And anyway, most of the loans are rand denominated, and countries do not default on their own currency denominated debt. Is this a fiscal cliff? If this is not a fiscal cliff, it is very, very close to one.
I'm sure the minister who was there for 4 days is quite happy you didn't blame him for anything. I noticed, you left him out of it. So at least he didn't cause any damage, at least. No.
Lukanyo, would you call this a fiscal cliff?
Dawie, when you get into these terms, fiscal cliffs, debt crisis, in a way, for me, it almost becomes almost a bit too technical, almost too, what's the word I'm looking for? People throw away terms all the time, or like austerity, but my issue, or what I worry about, is the sustainability of our economy and the sustainability of our country, even the sustainability of our society, because surely we can't go on like this. So in the end, it becomes an academic debate. Is fiscal cliff or not? The question is, where are we going to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time?
But I think Lukanyo's comments earlier to say that it seems like this budget speech was actually a speech towards their own people, sitting in government, spending like no tomorrow, and he's actually telling the guys the truth. And unfortunately, that is maybe a predicament that we sit in, because these numbers are not turning around.
Willem, I've got some, and Lukanyo, I've got some slide, or 1 or 2 slides there where I'm actually going to touch on what you've just said. And I share that. It doesn't matter really being technical. The reality is that if people are suffering out there, if people are poor out there, if people are not getting inflation-related kind of increases, for example, then people get angry. And I'm afraid that is the political or the social reality in which we found ourselves. All right, let's have a look at this one. Now, the Minister of Finance did mention that he's going to go, and this is something good. This is something, it takes time again to implement these sort of things. He did mention it a year or two ago already, or a year ago or so, a so-called zero-based budget. The zero-based budget, he did spend some time on that, saying that we have to go through all the expense items of the state, and that we need to make sure that every expense item is something that money needs to be spent on. It's a good thing. We should do this, and I think hope for him that certainly will be successful in doing that. And I think he mentioned he's going to start with finance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's one of there's 2 departments. I think, and his being one of them, which I think is a good way to also to set an example. I mean, looking at those, they do look quite ambitious. Some of the goals. And we always talk back to the politics of everything: zero-based budgeting, the wage bill. The question is there the political will to support him and back him to do? Because these things are not going to be popular. Even if you look at the budget, a lot of the stuff makes sense. Like I said, as a human being, as a South African, and knowing the kind of level of poverty here, I understand people's anger on the social grants. But I also understand that he doesn't have a choice.
Yeah.
But then also not only that, but then he also has to take another political hit by being seen to be being nice to business. It's talking about tax cuts for companies, and then talking about middle class people being shelved from budget creep. I think he's a very brave man, and I think it's a very brave speech that he gave.
It was,
and of course it's not going to be perfect. These are hard decisions, but there are people out there who think there aren't decisions to be made.
Yeah.
And I think We didn't actually mention him today. I think one of the great speeches last year, for example, was from the governor, Khanyago, when he gave at Vets. And I can't remember the exact title, but half the title was like something about monetary policy in the age of magic money. So there are people out there who actually still believe there is magic money. And they believe the finance minister doesn't have to make these choices, which I don't understand why he would make these choices if he didn't have to. I mean, surely his life would be a lot easier if he didn't have to make them.
Yeah, one or two other comments. The Minister of Finance did spend some time on the funding for the vaccine, and I can't understand why so many people talk about that, because in a bigger scheme of things, there's a relatively small amount of money.
Oh yeah, I mean that will, like, I mean, even if it was double or even triple.
Yeah,
I mean, if you take the cost of a lockdown, I mean, 10 billion. If it means people are vaccinated, and it means people aren't getting sick, if it means, we don't have lockdowns. I mean, it goes without saying, and that's why we haven't even discussed it, because it's actually I don't think it's even worth discussing.
That's just a feel-good story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, for some weird reason people spend a lot of ink on that unnecessarily. Just a question on the IMF loan. There was nothing on that I've seen anyway.
Nothing on that actually. It was interesting. I mean, it didn't happen today, obviously. A couple of months ago, I was actually in an interview with IMF MD Kristalina Georgieva, where we talked about the thing I was talking about, how unfair it is. Countries in the West can just print money with no consequences. I said, what about the rest of countries like South Africa? Then one of the answers she gave me was that maybe a country like South Africa should consider cheaper options of finance, i.e. not borrowing in the open markets. And I don't know whether she was lobbying that South Africa goes to the IMF for more money. I don't know.
I saw that article.
I just saw, but it was one of those, in this day of Zoom meetings, you can't really follow up. Somebody answers a question, then they move on.
But the point is, I don't believe South Africa needs an IMF loan, at least not soon. And I think even the other one that we took out last year, I don't think we could have gotten away without that one, actually. So an IMF loan is not on the cards for now, at least not in the short term, I believe.
I mean, we could have paid it back now with our little bonanza from the commodity prices.
Yeah, we could have. One or two other announcements. The 12Js were killed. That's the 12J investments. Yeah. So it's not getting more years on that. There was about just over 5 billion rand spent on that for the past 5 years. And then the Minister of Finance did make a comment about pension fund changes, making it easier for pension funds to invest in capital projects. Now, I must tell you, Lukanyo, I'm getting a little bit uneasy about that one, because I'm very, very concerned about eventually a prescribed kind of thing for pension funds. Once they run out of money, the only pot of gold left is the pension funds.
I suppose that we will know when that when that actually happens. I mean, when you, based on everything else he said and how sensible he is, for me it's hard to see him advocating something like that. This issue, I suppose it comes up and again because it's a fear that people have, but I don't know whether it's based on reality. In terms, because we know from the previous government that it didn't work, and we know that it had savers, and we know it led to suboptimal investment decisions. So we sort of know this is not. We know how it distorts markets. We know all these things. So but maybe if things get so bad, you get to a point where things are so desperate, people do things that they know that's wrong. But then, as you say, we're not there with the IMF money. So I'm not think we actually there to be panicking about prescribed assets. But
Lukanyo, what we're not seeing is that government is not actually encouraging people to save for their old age. We can't continue paying old age grants, but even legislation that changed earlier this year regarding provident funds, that the amount won't be available as a lump sum anymore. It's all going to be annualized. It's again certain rules that changed for people immigrating on their pension funds, retirement annuities. Pension fund or RA contributions, that's limited, although it went up to 27.5%, but it's all limited. Tax-free savings, why is it limited? And then one of the other vehicles that was very tax efficient for the people who actually met their top level on pension fund contributions was a 12J investment. Another excellent sort of tax friendly investment for the man out there. And that's unfortunate. We don't encourage people to save for retirement.
The answer is very simple and easy because they're losing taxes on it. It's simple
Yes.
as that.
Yes.
And the state, encouraging us to save, but the biggest destroyer of savings is in fact the state. All right, let's go on. A couple of other announcements that I think and some outstanding issues that we still need to get a bit of clarity on. Eskom is the big outstanding issue. We know Eskom is getting that 32 billion rand. That was nothing new. We knew about that. Eskom also getting a 15% increase that we heard recently. I think eventually Eskom will have to be bailed out somehow or the other. Total outstanding debt is about 500 billion, and we keep on kicking that can down the road, Lukanyo.
I've actually like remember when I actually was working overseas, I remember colleagues there would ask me like, why don't you just like impose a haircut on the bondholders? That I mean, like, if you go to South America, that happens all the time with all the SOEs, or at least do something, because we seem to be scared to do anything, one way or the other. It was like 2 years ago that the former chair of Eskom was talking about the 100 billion being taken into the government's balance sheet. Remember, like I think the debt then was probably like 300 billion. I just don't know what it was. Like it just keeps growing and growing, and we just keep kicking that one down the road. I mean, at some point we have to deal with it.
Yeah.
I think there are positive things in fairness with Eskom. I mean, it's being reformed. I think most people agree that the new CEO is doing a good job.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a technical person, but it looks like with the restructuring and the separation, there seems to be progress is being made on the legal front, and there's much more openness now to have diversity in the market. I mean, it's amazing, really. Like when I because when I lived in the UK, I remember I would have like choice of like 40 like power producers, and they've got a similar population as us, and here we have a monopoly.
We've got to run here, Lukanyo. We've got to run. There are a couple of other things. The 3.5 billion is extra for South African Airways. I don't know. Was there actually an extra amount?
Yeah.
Let me just know. Is there?
I mean, I think this is to do with the extra cost to do with the business rescue.
Okay,
there
so
wasn't.
Is this new money?
I mean, I remember like there was this controversy last year when it got that 10.5 billion. I mean, based on reading this is then another 3 billion on top of that.
On top of that,
There was no real new money.
So because initially I think the whole total was 16, now it's like 19. So it is new money.
it is new money.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Couple of other ones we have to go run round. It seems to me Denel's got to be closed down. There's no more money for Denel. That's all I can think of. The road accident fund, there's nothing mentioned about that, but the actual deficit on that thing is hundreds of billions, apparently. Land Bank getting another 7 billion, nothing new there. Sunroll, nothing extra on Sunroll. And then, of course, the pet hobby of the minister himself, and it's a state bank. I didn't see anything on that.
No, I don't think we'll ever see anything official on that. I mean, he likes to bring it up, but then when you actually ask in actual real time or like how you do that, then normally like then the answer will be not from other executive, I mean people in the treasury or whatever. Then the answer will be like, oh no, we're talking about how we can make the land bank work better, or we can maybe use the post bank. But then it's like, no, we're not actually talking about a new bank at all. So like, and it's a pet love of his, but he brings up once in a while. But I don't think it's a serious policy thing. I mean, do we need another SOE?
Definitely no. Definitely no. Let's go through the final plans. The president planned, and I think you referred to that, Willem, 100 billion, which will be stacked over the next couple of, the employment plan of the president over the next couple of years. I think he set aside a couple of billion rand for that. 12 or 15 billion rand on that, I think.
Yeah, there's about 11 billion. Actually,
11 billion for that.
To go towards
and
that.
then what I'm quite concerned about, there was nothing said about this in the budget, and that's the investment targets of the president, which will not be achieved, I believe. This is something you referred to, Lukanyo, and this is a report that I read from the International Monetary Fund. The wage bill increase is going to be much lower. The IMF is concerned about political disruptions and unrests, not only in South Africa, globally, but if there's one country that is certainly a candidate for this, it is certainly South Africa. Low wage increases, high levels of unemployment, so we have to be very, very concerned about possibilities of, let's call it, unrest in South Africa.
No, I mean, definitely. I think like in the budget review, like it says, we spoke about our growth numbers. They say they happen 3.3%, followed by 1.9, whatever over the next 3 years. India will do 11.5 this year. China more than 8%.
Yeah, it's
You know, like I mean, if you could get your growth up, that's a whole issue as well. I mean, then you sort out the debt issue without actually having to do so much consolidation. I mean, if you get this economy going.
maybe a few final takeaways, Willem.
Yes, I think so. I think what we can do is we can wrap up with this. It's actually a nice topic, the takeaways post-COVID, where that was not available. So maybe just let's wrap up. I mean, one or two things that you still got slides on, Dawie, and we can take it from there.
Okay, just a quick one or two things. I think this is my view about South Africa. I think South Africa's got really amazing opportunities. I think quite often we simply don't use the opportunities. I think it's life, the politicians quite often make it simply difficult for us to use the opportunities. We can really, there's so much energy in South Africa that we can unleash, that we can really set free. Unfortunately, there are a number of obstacles in the way, and I must say our political leadership certainly is that, or part of that at least. Fiscal accounts is certainly hovering on the edge. What we've just been talking about tonight, I'm seriously concerned about. I don't think we've ever been so deep in trouble in South Africa as today. And for this, you need really strong and exceptional political leadership to get us out of this. Maybe an asset allocation that I have, I'm very bullish in the short term on our local bonds for a number of reasons. A very important one has to do with the fact that we've got exceptionally liquid and well-regulated markets. So the local bonds, I think, is a sitter, quite attractive. Local equities, pretty much the same. I think our local equities are still quite cheap. International bonds, I don't like international bonds because they're very expensive. International equities, I'm actually quite bullish on because I believe that all this stimulus is likely to add to economic growth internationally. So that's more or less my asset allocation. And then the last comment that I would like to make about individuals. My advice to individuals is, yes, certainly there are many opportunities in South Africa, but it is also your responsibility to make sure that a substantial portion of your assets are invested abroad.
Lukanyo, a positive last message from your side, a takeout?
I mean, it's hard to disagree with what Dawie just said. I mean, South Africa is a great country. I mean, like that's why we're here. You know, it's a country of great opportunity, and I think it could have a future. We just need to do the things that we know we need to do. You know, like and it's not really a purely South African thing. In fact, there's a lack of political will. Yeah. I mean, even when I lived in Europe, one of the in rich countries, when they have the sovereign debt crisis, remember that quote from Juncker, who was head of the European Commission, and then he said, "People think we don't know what to do." He said, "We actually know what to do. We just don't know how to do it and stay in power." so I think we need to have that will where to do the right thing, even if it means losing power or losing popularity. You know, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, whose reforms paved the way for Angela Merkel's long reign. I mean, because he took the tough decisions, which meant he got actually outvoted, and then somebody else got the benefit.
Exactly.
Thank you, guys. Lukanyo, Dawie, thank you for being here. My positive takeout. And it's actually one of the positive things that it is... who was the guy that actually stuffed up the debit? Praveen Gordhan. He actually implemented it. And that was no tax on African beer. And it was continued again today. No tax on African beer. Positive takeout. And I think the biggest positive thing is that in South Africa, you need to be entrepreneurial. If you would like to fix potholes, you can only do it in Africa and in Southern Africa. So be streetwise. We all are streetwise. Once again, Lukanyo from Business Day side, thank you for being a business partner. Thank you for joining us today. Dawie from the Efficient Group. I mean, the group is really turning the world around, not only in South Africa, but worldwide. And everything what they do is a financial services business. Thank you for being here as the Chief Economist. And I think we got all the lessons. This video or this presentation will also be available after this session. So you guys can actually just go to the link and we will make the link available to you. From my side, thank you very much. Thank you also to the production team and the guys that helped us out today to actually make this happen. And I hope their name will, as Virtual Productions, will actually be run. Great job, guys, the sound guys, the camera guys. Thanks for very much. And you out there, the viewer, thank you for joining in, spending an hour with us. And guys, if you need financial solutions or financial help, you know where to get the Efficient Group, and at least buy the right newspaper tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Extra supplement tomorrow.
Extra supplement tomorrow. Big one. Thanks, guys. Keep well.